The Irish, particularly along the west and south coasts, have the closest DNA correspondence with northern Spain and Portugal. And coming from a family that had served the Spanish and the Austrian monarchies in Europe, we in Ireland owe a huge cultural debt of gratitude to Spain. Bazin recommended that Philip should invade and take Ireland first. It is a myth to say that the Spanish Armada was defeated by the small English flotilla. That's a myth. Spain is our oldest ally and friend.
La historia de España e Irlanda es una historia de amistad. Dos países de impronta católica que lucharon por conservar sus raíces cristianas en sus territorios. Una relación que la podemos remontar si queremos a los iberoceltas, que tendrán una especial relevancia en la visión histórica de Carlos V y Felipe II sobre la isla de San Patricio. Un enemigo común en el siglo XVI, la protestante Inglaterra. Y un hecho que marcará el destino común de ambas culturas para siempre, la Spanish Armada. ¿Planearon España e Irlanda invadir Inglaterra? Hoy conoceremos estas relaciones históricas de la mano del historiador de la Universidad de Dublín, Declan Downey. Acomódense porque hoy sí que sí, esta entrevista en Trincheras Ocultas promete.
We have to remember that it was the Spanish Habsburg monarchy that provided the facilities for Irish culture and literature and identity to survive.
Bienvenidos un día más a Trincheras Ocultas, bienvenidos a un nuevo programa que me hace muchísima ilusión presentar porque me encuentro en Irlanda, me encuentro en Dublín porque vamos a hablar de la Spanish Armada hoy con un auténtico experto, un historiador irlandés que nos va a dar su visión desde aquí de lo que ocurrió en ese siglo XVI con la Spanish Armada. También nos va a hablar de las relaciones históricas entre España e Irlanda y vuelvo a repetir, para mí es un auténtico privilegio poder hablar de este periodo gracias a Declan Downey. Y voy a decir una cosa antes de presentarle, la introducción está siendo en español, pero la entrevista va a ser en inglés y voy a añadir los subtítulos para que todos ustedes puedan entenderlo. Y también seguro que muchísimos saben inglés, así que va a ser muy fácil entender el curso de esta entrevista, porque además van a ver que Declan Downey sabe muy bien de lo que habla y tiene en su cabeza ese concepto de hispanidad, en la que, por cierto, aquí como profesor en la Universidad de Dublín, intenta siempre enseñar a sus alumnos que la hispanidad también es el futuro. Así que muchísimas gracias y voy a presentar ya, voy a cambiar al inglés a nuestro invitado de hoy. Thanks a lot, Declan Downey, for being here today with us in Trincheras Ocultas. For me, it's a real pleasure.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me too.
I would like to ask you as the first question, when was the first time that you heard about the Spanish Armada?
I was about 5 years of age. My grandparents brought me up to see Spanish Point in County Clare. I was visiting them during summer holidays, and they brought me to see this place, and my grandparents told me the story about the wreckage of the Armada, what had happened to the survivors there, the massacre by the English, all of that. And my grandfather then sat me down with a great book, Kilfeather's History of the Spanish Armada at the time. So this is way back in the early 1970s, so it's well over 50 years ago. So anyhow, that was my first introduction to the story of the Spanish Armada. And coming from a family that had served the Spanish and the Austrian monarchies in Europe, as my family had gone into exile for a number of years, I was always conscious of the fact that there are a number of Irish families who have this tradition of service in the Habsburg monarchy in Spain and Austria and the Low Countries. and what we call the Netherlands and Belgium, Luxembourg nowadays. And as I say, it was that sort of interest that spurred me, especially when so much that had been written about Irish families abroad was to do with the Irish in France. I decided I would look at the whole history of the Irish, the earlier history and the much greater history indeed of the Irish and the Habsburg monarchy. So that's what brought me into this sphere.
And how was the relationship between Spain and Ireland in this 16th century? For example, we have examples, no, of Irish people, soldiers in the Tercios de Flanders.
Well, in the history of Irish migration, if you look at the general historiography of this, most people think of Irish emigrants to America or to Australia or Britain or New Zealand, to the English-speaking world, in other words, and it's mainly a 19th and 20th century focus. But there was a much earlier tradition of Irish migration in great numbers, and that goes back to the 16th and 17th centuries, indeed into the 18th. So that is where the earlier history of Irish migration begins in the modern period. And in that regard, you have to understand that in 16th century Ireland, it was a period of great turbulence because the English Tudor monarchy wanted to create a centralized state, everything focused on London. And here in Ireland at that time, the English claimed to be overlords of Ireland. That was a constitutional arrangement going back to 1172, when Henry II, King of England, Duke of Normandy, Duke of Anjou, had extended his jurisdiction over Ireland on the basis of a papal bull called Laudabiliter, which was given to him by the one and only English-born Pope Nicholas Breakspere, known as Pope Adrian IV. So on that basis, the English kings or the English monarchy had the title Lords of Ireland. But when Henry VIII went into schism with Rome and began what was called the English Reformation, he wanted to extend English control completely over Ireland. And you have to understand that up until 1541, Ireland was known as a lordship under English nominal jurisdiction, but it was a papal fiefdom as well. And therefore, outside of the English Pale of Dublin, which was a small area of about 50 square kilometres, outside of that, you had autonomous regions in Ireland. In fact, some of them were quite independent, such as the O'Neill and the O'Donnell kingdoms and lordships in the north of Ireland. And then you had the great Geraldine or Desmond earldoms in the south, my ancestors. So these were autonomous regions, like the Duchy of Burgundy. The Duchy of Burgundy provides a good example of this because while it was part of the Reichskreise in the Holy Roman Empire, the Burgundian Kreis, it was also a vassal state in law of the Kingdom of France. But the Dukes of Burgundy had tremendous autonomy of the French monarchy. It was too weak. So the Dukes of Burgundy behaved and acted like semi-independent monarchs in their own right. So when the English Tudor monarchy began to encroach upon the privileges of the Geraldine Palatinate, the Earls of Desmond revolted. And this coincided, of course, with the religious reformation in England, which Henry VIII tried to extend to Ireland. But as you know, the Irish did not follow. Yes. So religion became bound up with the politics, but there was also trade. And this is an aspect that has often been missed. From the Middle Ages, there had been very close trading links between the west and the southwest of Ireland and Spain and Portugal. and the whole Bay of Biscay area, western France as well. So the English wanted to get control of that very lucrative trade. And we can come back to details about that later in this interview if you like. But shall we say that for the Iberian world, especially Spanish and Portuguese fishermen, access to the waters off the southwest of Ireland was vital for their fishing industry. They were the deep sea fishermen of the Middle Ages, not the Irish. And the Irish lords, the autonomous lords in the west and the south of Ireland, gave licenses to these fishermen, especially to follow the herring fisheries in the Atlantic. And we do know that the Basque fishermen knew about the herring migrating up through the Atlantic up to the coasts of Greenland and Newfoundland. And they kept that a secret in medieval Europe. And what they did was they used to bring their catches to the west coast of Ireland and the south coast of Ireland, where they had licenses, and we still have written examples of those licenses, from lords such as the O'Sullivan Bear or the O'Donnell family in Donegal, or indeed the Earls of Desmond and others, who gave them license to bring their herring catches in on shore, where they had these factories for salting the fish or smoking the fish and then exporting them back to the markets in Iberia and southern Europe. So this was a very lucrative trade. And of course, following the fishing trade, you also had a very intensive trade in wine. Medieval Ireland was the largest importer in Europe of wines from Gascony and Spain and Portugal. This is one of the things that the English, in their own official records, state that the English monarchy must get control of this lucrative trade for taxation and revenue. So that is the other dimension, quite apart from the political and the religious. We have had a very long connection in Ireland with Spain and Portugal. And that's just the medieval side. We can go back further in history again to the time of the Roman Empire, and even earlier than the Roman Empire, because the oldest books of Irish literature, for example, the Laur Gawala, the book of invasions or conquests or gatherings, whatever you'd like to call it, but that's how roughly it translates. It's an ancient medieval text based on earlier texts, earlier historical legends, etc., about the earliest inhabitants coming to these islands. They came from Spain. This is the Milesian origin legend, as it's called in history, whereby the first farming communities that arrived in Ireland, and this is supported by the archaeology and recently by the DNA mapping. The Irish, particularly along the west and south coasts, have the closest DNA correspondence with northern Spain and Portugal. So it's the Ibero-Celtic peoples who migrated. The story of Breogan, the story of Amergin, and the poem of Amergin is one of the oldest pieces of literature that we in Ireland share with Galicia. And back in the 5th century AD, the post-Christian era, we have Orosius of Braga being one of the first historians to recount the migrations of the Ibero-Celtic peoples to Ireland. And then in the 8th century, the great Isidore of Seville also wrote about this. So their works influenced the early Irish monasteries and their literature and historical recordings as well. And in the 16th century, when the Earls of Desmond first approached Charles V and first in 1528, when they sent their envoys to Toledo to negotiate an alliance with him against Henry VIII of England, they refer in their letters to the Emperor King to their common ancestry, that the Irish are not just a people in the North Atlantic subject to Britain and want to throw off the yoke of the English king, Henry VIII. They are a people who are like the Spanish, descended from the same Ibero-Celtic roots. So here you have in 1528 and again in 1529, when the alliance was sealed with the Treaty of Dingle, 28th of April 1529, by Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba, the envoy of the Emperor King Charles V and First, and James the 11th Earl of Desmond, James Fitzgerald. And Fitzgerald makes it very clear that he is now transferring his allegiance, his feudal homage, from Henry VIII to the Emperor King Charles V, not just only for religious reasons and political reasons, but also for racial reasons. He refers to reconnecting with their common ancestry. Spain is our oldest ally and friend.
The oldest.
And the oldest, yes. In 1529, we have the Treaty of Dingle. Now, yes, it is true that a few years earlier, in 1523, the same Earl James of Desmond had signed a treaty of alliance with Francois I of France against Henry VIII. But the French did not deliver. That alliance fell through. Francois I was captured at Pavia by Charles V in 1525. So James of Desmond, being a very astute politician at the time, realized he had a better option with Charles V than with the French king. And that alliance, 1529, the Treaty of Dingle, granted rights of privilege to the Irish merchants and migrants who went to Spain. And so these privileges that were granted by Charles V to the Irish in his dominions were reconfirmed by his son Philip II and Philip III, his grandson, and even Philip V, the first Bourbon king, reaffirmed the ancient privileges of the Irish in Spain. And you have to understand that right through the 17th century, you have an increasing number of Irish figures in the Spanish court. So they occupied the councils of war, the councils of state. I'm thinking of people like Philip O'Sullivan Bear, Dermizio O'Sullivan Bear, their father, Diarmid O'Sullivan Bear, and Donald Calm O'Sullivan Bear. So you have all of this. So it's a whole connection, because again, when the Elizabethan Tudor conquest succeeded at the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th centuries, after the Battle of Kinsale, we have to remember that it was the Spanish Habsburg monarchy that provided the facilities for Irish culture and literature and identity to survive. So you have, for example, Trinity College Dublin was established by Elizabeth I of England in March 1592. And its express purpose in its charter, its foundation charter, was to Anglicize Ireland and to spread the Protestant religion. And that is in March of 1592. Philip II countered that cultural warfare, if you like, by establishing the first Royal Irish College in Salamanca in August 1592, just a few months later. Now, there had been Irish hostels for students attending Valladolid and Salamanca and Alcalá before that, but now you have a formal establishment of a college under royal patronage and protection of the Spanish crown, established in Salamanca, the foremost university in Spain at that time, by Philip II.
Because Philip II, he knew that Ireland was Catholic?
It was to help the Irish preserve not just only their Catholic faith, but also their cultural identity. The first printing presses in the Irish language were set up in the Royal Irish Colleges at Leuven or Lovaina in Flanders and at Antwerp, again under the protection of the Spanish Habsburg monarchy. So you have the preservation of Irish literature, language, culture, identity in this proliferation of Irish colleges in Spain, in Portugal, in Spanish Flanders, right through the 16th and 17th centuries, into the 18th century. They survive even down to the 20th century. So
Spain was crucial
it was crucial
to understand Ireland. No.
Exactly. We in Ireland owe a huge cultural debt of gratitude to Spain.
Okay, that's so interesting.
Because of the foresight of the Spanish monarchy, as well as the foresight of those Irish scholars and political figures who requested the monarchy's help in setting up these institutions. And Spain gave generously and readily to the Irish. And that is a debt that we will not forget.
It's so interesting because we are talking about the relationship between Spain and Ireland. But I want to ask you another question at the end of the interview, because it's related to this connection. But before, I want to talk about the Spanish Armada a bit. I want to know what was the main goal of Philip II with the Spanish Armada. He wanted to invade England.
Me gustaría ser reina de Inglaterra.
What was the real goal of Philip II?
Okay, the real goal of Philip II was to neutralize England. You have to understand that from 1558 onwards, Elizabeth I was on the throne of England. She was Philip's sister-in-law. Remember that Philip had been king consort in England to Mary I, Elizabeth's half-sister. He had also been King of Ireland. When Elizabeth came to the throne in England, Philip had protected her in the hope that she would moderate her position in terms of Protestantism, that she would reconcile with the Catholic faith. She led him to believe she would. He protected her for a number of years from the French and indeed from the papacy. But as you know, in 1570, that irascible Pope Pius V had excommunicated Elizabeth. So this was done without Philip's agreement, and it gave Elizabeth an excuse politically to start persecuting the Catholics in England and Ireland. So with that, you also had the rise in England itself of a strong Calvinist faction in the English court, led by the Earl of Leicester. And England became very much linked up with the international Calvinist political movement. And so Spain was confronted by this in the revolt in the Netherlands, for instance, by the Huguenots in France, the French Wars of Religion that had started out after 1560. So Philip was facing war on a number of fronts, and counter-reformed Catholicism was also facing war on a number of fronts from international Calvinism. You have to understand that from 1580 onwards, you had English privateering gathering momentum against Spanish and Flemish Burgundian shipping between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, and indeed on the transatlantic trade as well. And Philip felt that it was time perhaps to launch an invasion in England itself, depose Elizabeth, place a Catholic claimant on the throne, and indeed there were quite a few legitimate claimants who had greater legitimacy than Elizabeth I to the throne of England. Creating a bridgehead in the North Atlantic to counter international Calvinism was a vital strategic move. Now, the original plan to take England did not actually originate with Philip II himself. It actually originated with the Marqués de Santa Cruz, Álvaro de Bazán. that Grand Admiral of Castile, who led the Azores campaign in 1583 to recover the Azores from the Prior of Crato, Dom Pedro, the Portuguese pretender, who had English support. And in that expedition, there were a group of exiles from Ireland known as the Geraldine Exiles. These had been from Desmond in the southwest. These had been a group of people who had gone into exile after the defeat of the Second Desmond War in 1583. So what you had was the migration of Irish military figures into the Spanish services from this time in greater numbers. And there was a group of Geraldine exiles, mariners, soldiers, navigational pilots, who worked with Álvaro de Bazán in his conquest of the Azores. And through his conversations with them and getting a sense of what the situation was like in Ireland, he drew up a plan. So the first plan for an invasion of England, or an enterprise of England, if you like, was put forward by Santa Cruz to Philip II and the Royal Council in 1583, after the Azores expedition. Bazán recommended that Philip should invade and take Ireland first. And having secured Ireland as a bridgehead, then you could have a pincer invasion movement. Spanish and Irish forces together from the west, and Spanish Burgundian forces from the southeast in Flanders. A pincer invasion from the west and the southeast onto England itself. That was the original plan. But as we know, that was countered by the Duke of Parma, who came up with another plan. By this stage, Bazán, or Santa Cruz, was dead, and Parma suggested that Medina Sidonia should lead the Armada fleet to Flanders first, and that they would leave Ireland out of it and instead launch the invasion from the southeast, from Flanders into Kent, and take London first. And, well, if Philip had stuck with the original plan of Santa Cruz, things might have been different. But the rest is history. An opportunity missed.
Opportunity missed, like that's so interesting too. And after this episode, we have like, I don't know how many ships, 26, 28 ships, that these ships were shipwrecked in the western coast of Ireland. Which was, or what was the first impression of the local Irish people there? Like they saw these ships, these Spanish soldiers, these Spanish sailors. What happened with these Spanish people that they survived?
Well, first and foremost, let's get a few things clear. It is a myth to say that the Spanish Armada was defeated by the small English flotilla. That's a myth. Geoffrey Parker made that very, very clear in his work on the Spanish Armada, and he exploded the myth about Sir Francis Drake.